March 15, 1968, 32 p.m., Small's Paradise Jazz Club was packed that night. The kitchen was chaos in the way only a Friday service could create. Steam rose from every pot, knives hit cutting boards in a rhythm like percussion, and voices called out orders in a language only chefs understand. Marcus Webb stood at the center of it all, his white jacket immaculate despite the heat, his movements precise and controlled. He'd been the head chef at Small's Paradise for 3 years, and in those 3 years, he'd become something of a legend. His food was art, his technique was flawless, but tonight, his hands were trembling in a way nobody at the station could see. In his jacket pocket was a small glass vial. Inside that vial was strychnine, the kind that kills silently, the kind that makes a man's muscles seize so hard they break his own bones from the inside. Marcus had $75,000 waiting for him in Miami if he could pull this off. All he had to do was poison one plate, just one plate. The target was Bumpy Johnson, the man who controlled Harlem, the man who sat in that dining room every Friday night at exactly 8:45 p.m., the man who'd promised Marcus Webb something he couldn't refuse. 20 months earlier, Marcus Webb was a different man. He was working at a mid-level restaurant in Washington Heights. Decent money, decent reputation. But he had a problem that no amount of honest income could solve. His younger brother, Daniel, had gotten involved with a street crew in the Bronx. Not just involved, he'd witnessed a murder. He'd seen the faces of the killers. And now, those killers wanted him silenced permanently. The crew's boss, a man named Vincenzo Castellano, had given Daniel 2 options: leave New York and never come back, or disappear permanently. Daniel was 17 years old. He had no money, no connections, nowhere to run. Marcus had tried everything. He'd saved money, sold his car, borrowed from lenders, but he was still short. He needed $12,000 to get Daniel set up in California, a new name, a new life, somewhere safe. That's when he'd met a woman named Rosa at a bar in Harlem. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and she seemed genuinely interested in his problems. They'd talked for hours. She'd listened to everything, and then she'd made him an offer. Not for $12,000, for $75,000. All he had to do was get a job at Small's Paradise, wait for the right moment, and poison Bumpy Johnson's food. Just like that. The money would be his, Daniel would be safe, and he could disappear. Rosa worked for the Italian mob. She'd been sent specifically to find someone desperate enough to do this job, someone from inside the kitchen, someone nobody would suspect. Marcus had said no at first. He'd said he wasn't a killer, but then Rosa had shown him pictures. Pictures of Daniel walking to school, pictures of Daniel at the library, pictures of Vincenzo Castellano's crew following him, waiting, getting ready, and she'd smiled that perfect smile and said, "Your brother dies in 2 weeks unless you do this. You're his only family, Marcus. You're his only chance." Marcus had signed on. He'd gotten the job at Small's Paradise by being exactly what he was, a brilliant chef. Bumpy had eaten his food on the 3rd day and declared it the best he'd had in years. Within a month, Marcus was part of Bumpy's inner circle, invited to sit at the boss's table sometimes, trusted with meal preparation. Everything had gone perfectly according to plan. Until 3 weeks ago, when everything fell apart, Bumpy Johnson didn't become king of Harlem by being naive. He became king by knowing things. And he'd known that someone in his inner circle was working with the mob. He didn't know who. He didn't know how, but he knew. So Bumpy had done what he always did. He'd set a trap. He'd called Marcus into his office one Tuesday afternoon and told him something that changed everything. Bumpy had said, "I know you're working with Rosa. I know about Daniel. I know about the poison you've been carrying around for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. And I know exactly what you're going to do." Marcus remembered the way his blood had gone cold, the way the room had seemed to shrink. He'd thought about running, about pulling a knife, about doing anything but standing there. But Bumpy had raised a hand. "Before you do something stupid, listen to me." For the next 2 hours, Bumpy had told Marcus Webb a story. A story about a man named Thomas Chen, who'd worked as Bumpy's accountant 5 years earlier. Thomas had been brilliant with numbers, trustworthy, reliable, and then the mob had gotten to him too. They'd threatened his family. Thomas had agreed to steal from Bumpy, to siphon off hundreds of thousands from Bumpy's operations over 6 months. Thomas had thought nobody would notice. He'd been wrong. Bumpy had noticed everything. And instead of killing Thomas, instead of disappearing him, Bumpy had done something different. Bumpy had let Thomas steal every penny he'd planned to steal. But here's the thing nobody understood about Bumpy Johnson. He didn't just react to threats, he created opportunities out of them. While Thomas was stealing, Bumpy was watching every connection Thomas made with the mob. He was tracking every member of the organization who came into contact with Thomas. He was mapping out the entire structure of their operation. By the time Thomas had finished stealing, Bumpy had a complete blueprint of how the mob worked in New York, and then Bumpy had made a move that shocked everyone. He'd given the information to the FBI, not for reward money, for leverage. The FBI had used that information to take down 3 major mob operations, 17 arrests, 42 convictions, and in the aftermath, the mob's power in New York had shifted dramatically. The 5 families had suffered their worst losses in a decade, all because they'd tried to turn one man. Thomas was alive. The mob couldn't touch him because Bumpy had protected him. Bumpy had told Thomas the same thing he was now telling Marcus. You're going to finish what you started. Marcus had stared at him, not understanding. You're going to poison my food tomorrow night at exactly 8:45 p.m. You're going to do it in front of witnesses. And then something very interesting is going to happen. Marcus had shaken his head. I don't understand. Bumpy had smiled. That thin smile that made most men nervous. You will. Tomorrow night at 8:47, you'll understand everything. And then Bumpy had handed Marcus an envelope. Inside was $12,000 in cash. That's for Daniel. It's enough for a new start in California. You can send it to him tonight if you want. Or you can finish this job and find out what happens next. Bumpy had paused. But know this, Marcus, if you take that money and disappear, I'll know within the hour. And I'll find you. More importantly, I'll find Daniel and he'll suffer in ways you can't imagine. But if you stay, if you do exactly what Rosa told you to do, I promise you something. You'll live, your brother will live, and you'll understand why Bumpy Johnson is king of Harlem. Marcus had spent the last 3 weeks in hell. He'd sent the money to Daniel. He'd watched his brother escape to California with a fake identity and a fresh start, but he'd stayed. He'd stayed because Bumpy Johnson had looked him in the eye and made a promise. And Marcus Webb had learned something in those 3 weeks. Bumpy Johnson never broke a promise. So here he was, March 15th, 8:32 p.m., with strychnine in his pocket and a death wish in his heart. The kitchen was slowing down now. The rush of dinner service was tapering off. Soon there would be a moment, a brief window when the executive chef would step away, when Marcus could prepare the special plate without anyone watching too closely. Marcus had been planning this for weeks. The poison would dissolve in the sauce. Bumpy always ordered the same thing on Friday nights, filet mignon with a red wine reduction. Perfect vehicle for strychnine. Death would come in minutes, violent and terrible, but quick. And then Marcus would slip out the back door and disappear into the night. Rosa had a car waiting. New documents were already prepared. By morning, he'd be on a plane. By next week, he'd be in Miami, safe, rich, alive. The only problem was this. Marcus didn't want to do it anymore. Over the last 3 weeks, he'd spent time around Bumpy Johnson. He'd heard stories from the kitchen staff about what Bumpy did for the community. He'd seen Bumpy help a dishwasher whose mother was sick, paying for treatments out of his own pocket. He'd watched Bumpy stand up for the people in his neighborhood against cops who wanted to shake them down for bribes. He'd listened to conversations at the bar where people talked about Bumpy like he was some kind of protector, some kind of god. And the more Marcus had learned, the more he'd realized something terrifying. He was about to kill a man who didn't deserve to die. He was about to murder someone who actually cared about his people. He was about to commit a sin that no amount of money or safety could justify. But what choice did he have? If he didn't do this, Rosa would know, the mob would know. Daniel would be hunted again, and this time, there would be no escape. At 8:40 p.m., Bumpy Johnson walked into the kitchen of Small's Paradise. This was unusual. Customers didn't come into the kitchen. But Bumpy was not a usual customer. He was the owner. He walked back to check on preparations sometimes, to see how his food was being made, to inspect the work of his staff. Marcus froze when he saw him. Bumpy was dressed impeccably as always, a charcoal suit and a burgundy tie, his signature fedora perched just so. He looked at Marcus and nodded slightly. That knowing nod that said, I know exactly what you're about to do, and I'm here to watch you do it. Bumpy walked over to where Marcus was standing. Up close, Bumpy was smaller than Marcus had expected. maybe 5'9", but the way he carried himself made him seem 10 feet tall. "How's the service tonight, chef?" Bumpy asked, his voice quiet and measured. "Good, Mr. Johnson. Clean, efficient," Marcus said, his voice barely steady. "I'm going to eat here tonight. Whatever the special is, you're going to prepare it for me. I'm going to sit down at my table with my people, and I'm going to eat it, and you're going to watch." Bumpy paused. "I want to know what happens, Marcus. I want to see what you do when the moment comes." Then Bumpy turned and walked back out into the dining room, leaving Marcus standing there with poison in his pocket and thunder in his chest. At 8:42 p.m., the head chef stepped away to deal with a supplier issue. At 8:43 p.m., Marcus prepared Bumpy's plate: filet mignon, perfectly cooked, medium rare, still warm from the broiler. The red wine reduction was heating on the stove. The sauce that would make this meal special, the sauce that would carry the strychnine into Bumpy's blood. Marcus stared at the vial in his hand. It was so small, just a few crystals, odorless, tasteless, invisible once dissolved. Nobody would know. Nobody would ever suspect the chef. The autopsy would show poison, but by then, Marcus would be gone. By then, he'd be starting a new life with $75,000 and a clean conscience. Except his conscience wasn't clean. His conscience was screaming. Marcus thought about his brother, safe in California with fake documents and a new name. Daniel was alive because of this moment. Daniel would never have escaped without the money Bumpy had given him. But Bumpy had given him that money anyway, knowing full well that Marcus was going to try to kill him. Why would a man do that? Why would Bumpy Johnson give away $12,000 to the brother of his would-be assassin? The answer came to Marcus in a flash of understanding that felt like lightning, because Bumpy Johnson was testing him. Not testing whether he'd poison the food. Testing whether he'd have the courage to do the right thing when the moment came. This wasn't a trap to catch a killer. This was a lesson. This was Bumpy Johnson trying to teach Marcus Webb something about loyalty, about character, about the difference between a man who kills for money and a man who has self-respect. Marcus looked at the vial in his hand. He looked at Bumpy's plate. And then he made a choice. He set the vial down on the counter behind him, in the pocket of a jacket that wasn't his, a jacket that belonged to one of the dishwashers. Then he poured the red wine reduction over the filet. The sauce was perfect. The plate was beautiful. It looked exactly like what he'd planned to serve, except that it carried no poison, no death, no betrayal. At 8:45 p.m., Marcus carried the plate through the dining room and placed it in front of Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy looked at the plate, then he looked at Marcus, and in his eyes, Marcus saw something that made his heart stop. Recognition. Bumpy knew exactly what Marcus had just done. Bumpy had been watching. Bumpy had known that this was the moment. This was when Marcus would either kill him or let him live. And Marcus had chosen. Bumpy picked up his fork. He cut into the filet. The meat was perfect, tender, the blades sliding through like butter. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, savoring the flavor, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. Then he swallowed, and he smiled. "Excellent, chef. Truly excellent. This is the best filet I've had in months." Marcus felt his knees weaken. Bumpy Johnson was alive. The poison had never touched his food. The poisoning had never happened. For a moment, Marcus felt relief so profound it nearly broke him. And then he realized the implications. If Bumpy was alive, if the poisoning never happened, then what was going to happen to him? What was going to happen when Rosa found out that he'd failed to complete the job? What was going to happen when the mob realized that he'd betrayed them? Marcus's eyes must have shown his panic because Bumpy set down his fork and gestured for Marcus to come closer. "Sit with me for a moment, chef," Bumpy said quietly. "We need to talk about your future." Marcus sat across from Bumpy Johnson at that table in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by people, surrounded by witnesses who could see them but not hear them. And Bumpy began to speak. 22 days ago, a woman named Rosa approached you with an offer, $75,000 to poison my food. You were desperate, so you said yes. 3 weeks ago, I found out about the arrangement. I could have killed you then. I could have killed Rosa. I could have made both of you disappear. But I didn't. I did something different. I gave you a choice. Bumpy paused and took another bite of his steak. That choice was simple. Kill me, or kill the idea that you're a man who can be bought. I gave your brother the money because I knew something you didn't know. I knew that once you understood what I was trying to do, you'd make the right choice, and you did. Marcus was shaking. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Now," Bumpy said, You're going to disappear tonight. You're going to walk out the back door of this kitchen, and you're never going to come back to Small's Paradise. You're never going to see me again. You're going to take what's left of your life, and you're going to make it mean something." Bumpy reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the table to Marcus. $5,000. Enough to get you where you need to go. Enough to start over somewhere far from New York, far from the mob, far from all of this. You pick somewhere, anywhere, and you go. You become someone else. You build a real life. Marcus opened the envelope with trembling hands. The money was there. $5,000. "But there's one condition," Bumpy continued. "You're going to tell Rosa that you poisoned me? You're going to tell her that I'm dead? You're going to tell her that the poison worked exactly as planned? And you're going to watch her leave, satisfied with your work. Because if you tell her the truth, if you tell her that you failed, she'll know that I'm alive and she'll come for me with everything the mob has. But if she thinks I'm dead, if she thinks the hit was successful, she'll disappear just like you're going to disappear. The mob will think they've won. They'll think they've finally taken me down. And in that moment of victory, they'll let their guard down. And that's when I'm going to move against them." Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "You see, Marcus, you were never supposed to poison me. You were supposed to make the mob think you poisoned me. You were supposed to be my mole on the inside, the one person they'd trust to tell them the job was done. And now that you've proven you have the character to choose loyalty over money, you're going to do exactly that. You're going to walk out of this kitchen tonight. You're going to meet Rosa. You're going to tell her exactly what happened, and then you're going to disappear. Don't come back. Don't contact anyone. Don't leave a trail. Just go." At 9:15 p.m., Marcus Webb walked out the back door of Small's Paradise with $5,000 in his pocket and a story he was about to tell. Rosa was waiting in the alley, sitting in the back of a black Cadillac, just like she had that first time when she'd recruited him. Marcus got in and closed the door. "It's done," he said. Rosa smiled, that perfect smile, and reached for him. Did he suffer? Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't, because that's when the back door of the Cadillac opened, and 4 men pulled him out into the alley. Marcus was thrown against the brick wall so hard his wind left his body. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He was about to die in an alley behind a jazz club in Harlem for a crime he never committed. And then he realized what was happening. These weren't mob enforcers. He'd been set up Bumpy's men. They grabbed Marcus and pulled him, struggling, through the kitchen and into the freezer. The industrial freezer where Small's Paradise kept its inventory of meat. It was the size of a room, cold enough to freeze a man solid, filled with hanging carcasses of beef and pork and lamb. They threw him inside and slammed the door shut. Marcus fell to the ground and lay there in the cold and the dark, wondering if Bumpy had lied to him after all. Wondering if this was how it ended for men who betrayed the mob. Wondering if he was going to freeze to death in a locker full of dead meat. He screamed. He pounded on the door. He begged for mercy. But there was no mercy. There was only the cold and the darkness and the horrible realization that he'd been played. Bumpy had said he wouldn't kill him. Bumpy had said he'd let him go. Bumpy had lied. Hours passed. Marcus didn't know how many. Time moved differently when you were trapped in ice and darkness. He sat there in the cold, his body shaking, his teeth chattering, his mind breaking into pieces. He was dying. He was absolutely certain that he was dying. And then the door opened. Light poured in, blinding him. And standing in that doorway was not Bumpy Johnson. It was Jerome, the man Bumpy used for surveillance work. "Come on," Jerome said, his voice hard. "Don't ask questions, just come." Marcus stumbled out of the freezer into the warm kitchen. His legs could barely hold him, his hands were numb. He was shaking so badly he couldn't stand. But Jerome pulled him up and dragged him through the kitchen, through the dining room, and toward the front of the club. As they walked, Marcus caught a glimpse of Bumpy's table. It was empty. Bumpy was gone. At the front door of Small's Paradise, Jerome shoved Marcus out onto the street. "Don't come back. Don't contact anyone at this club. Don't even think about Small's Paradise again. You understand me?" Marcus nodded, not understanding anything. "Where do I go?" he asked, his voice broken. "Away," Jerome said. "As far away as you can get." Bumpy's keeping his word. You'll live, but you live far from here. You live with what you did. And you live knowing that you were tested and you passed the test. But there's a price for that. The price is exile. Now go. And Marcus Webb went. He stumbled down the street in the middle of the night in March, numb from cold and shock and disbelief. He made it to Grand Central Station. He used some of the $5,000 to buy a ticket to Denver. He never looked back. He never contacted anyone in New York. He never told anyone what had happened that night in Small's Paradise. The story of what Marcus Webb almost did spread through the underworld, but it never became legend the way other stories did, because the story didn't make sense. A chef had poisoned Bumpy Johnson. Then Bumpy had lived. Then the chef had disappeared. The details were murky. Different people told it different ways. Some said the poison had been fake all along. Some said Bumpy's people had found out about the hit and prevented it. Some said Marcus Webb had been killed and his body was never found. But the truth was simpler and more complicated at the same time. The truth was that Bumpy Johnson had taken a desperate man and given him a choice. And that choice had changed everything. Within a week, the mob's operations in Harlem began to collapse. Someone had given the FBI information about their connections to Small's Paradise. Someone had revealed the identity of Rosa and her handlers. Within a month, 7 people had been arrested. Within 2 months, the Italian mob's presence in Harlem had been effectively dismantled. The 5 families never figured out who had given up the information. They suspected it was Marcus Webb, but Marcus was gone. He was in Denver by then, working in a small restaurant, living under a different name, a ghost of the man he used to be. He never told anyone what had really happened that night. He lived with the weight of his betrayal of the mob, the weight of his near murder of Bumpy Johnson, the weight of his choice to reject money and embrace honor. It was a heavy weight to carry, but it was his weight to carry, and carrying it meant he was alive. Bumpy Johnson never spoke about what happened with Marcus Webb. He never explained why he'd saved a man who'd tried to kill him. He never revealed how he'd used Marcus's attempted assassination as a weapon against the mob. Bumpy just went back to his corner table at Small's Paradise every Friday night and continued being the king of Harlem. He continued protecting his people. He continued turning threats into opportunities. He continued being 3 moves ahead. And somewhere in Denver, a man named Marcus Webb washed dishes and prepped ingredients and cooked meals that fed people who would never know his story, and he never looked back. The legend of the poisoning that never was became part of Harlem's mythology. People talked about it for years. They said Bumpy Johnson had such powerful magic, such incredible intuition, that he could detect poison with his mind. They said he was untouchable because the ancestors protected him. They said he could read a man's soul and know his intentions before the man himself did. None of them understood the truth. The truth was much simpler and much more profound. Bumpy Johnson had simply believed in the possibility of redemption. He'd believed that even a desperate man could choose honor. He'd believed that a choice, a single moment of decision, could reshape a person's entire life. And he'd been right. Because in that kitchen on March 15, 1960, at 8:43 p.m., Marcus Webb had made a choice, and that choice had saved both their lives. The real power, the real weapon, the real magic wasn't poison or bullets or violence. It was the ability to see a person as they could be, not as they were. It was the ability to give them a chance to become someone better. It was the ability to understand that sometimes the most dangerous move is the merciful one. That's what made Bumpy Johnson different from every other man in Harlem. That's what made him a legend. That's what made him king. And in a freezer full of meat, in a moment of cold darkness, a desperate man had learned the most valuable lesson of his life. Some debts can only be paid by staying alive. Some choices can only be made when everything else has been taken away. Some acts of mercy are the cruelest punishments of all, because they force you to live with yourself. They force you to understand what you almost became. They force you to spend the rest of your life knowing that someone believed in your capacity for goodness when you didn't believe in it yourself. Marcus Webb lived another 48 years after that night. He never became a famous chef. He never opened his own restaurant. He never achieved any of the things he'd dreamed about when he was younger, but he lived. He raised a family. He helped his community in small ways. He was kind to people. He paid his debts to the universe by being a good man, and it took him his whole life to do it. And sometimes, late at night, he'd remember the taste of that steak he'd prepared. The one he almost poisoned, the one that had become a turning point in his life. He'd remember the look in Bumpy Johnson's eyes, that look that said, "I see who you really are, and I believe you can be better." And Marcus Webb would feel grateful for a man he never saw again, A man who'd taught him that some choices matter more than money, more than safety, more than anything else in the world. A man who'd believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. A man who'd shown him that the greatest power in the world isn't taking a life, it's saving one. Years later, Marcus would hear that Bumpy Johnson had died, not from a bullet like so many predicted, but from a heart attack in 1968, and Marcus wept. He wept for the man who'd changed his life. He wept for the king of Harlem who'd chosen mercy over vengeance. He wept for a person he'd tried to kill, but who'd saved him instead. And he finally understood what it all meant. The poisoned plate, the freezer, the exile, the years of running. It wasn't punishment, it was salvation. Bumpy Johnson had given Marcus Webb the greatest gift any man could give. He'd given him a chance at redemption. He'd given him a chance at a life worth living. He'd given him a chance to become someone better than he was. In Harlem, respect wasn't given, it was earned. But sometimes, mercy was given freely. And that mercy was worth more than all the gold in the world. Marcus Webb understood that now, and he would carry that understanding for the rest of his days. He would live it, he would teach it, he would be it, because that's what Bumpy Johnson had taught him. That's what the poison had never touched. That's what the cold freezer could never freeze. That's what exile could never destroy. A man's capacity to change, a man's ability to choose honor over money, a man's power to become something greater than what he was born to be. And in Denver, in a small apartment above a restaurant, Marcus Webb would die at 85 years old. A good man, a humble man, a man who'd learned the most valuable lesson of his life from someone who'd had every reason to kill him but chose to save him instead. In Harlem, they would eventually find out that it was Marcus Webb who'd worked with Bumpy all those years ago. They would tell the story again and again. They would say that the chef who was supposed to poison Bumpy had instead become his greatest weapon against the mob. They would say that Bumpy Johnson's power was so great that he could turn an assassin into a patriot with nothing but a choice and a chance. But the real truth, the truth that only Bumpy and Marcus ever knew, was far simpler. It wasn't magic, it wasn't power. It wasn't strategy, though strategy played a part. It was belief. Pure belief in a man's capacity to be better. Pure belief that every person, even those hired to kill, had a choice. Pure belief that when you give someone a real option between money and honor, most will choose honor if they believe you truly mean it. Bumpy Johnson believed it, and he was right. And that belief changed not just Marcus's life, it changed the course of history in Harlem. It changed the balance of power in New York. It changed the entire trajectory of organized crime in the Northeast, all because one man believed in another man's capacity for redemption. Think about what that means for a moment. One decision, one man willing to risk everything on the idea that another man could choose honor over money, and from that single decision came a cascade of consequences that rippled outward for years, decades even. The mob's operations in Harlem collapsed within weeks. They never recovered that foothold. The 5 families had to restructure their entire northeastern network because of what happened in Smalls Paradise on one Friday night in March. Other criminal organizations took notice. They began to understand that you can't just corrupt people wholesale. That some communities, some neighborhoods, have leaders who understand something deeper than mere power. Bumpy Johnson taught them that lesson with mercy instead of violence. He taught them by believing in a desperate man when that man had already sold his soul. He taught them by saying, in essence, that any man can be redeemed if someone is willing to bet on him. And because Bumpy believed that, because he was willing to stake his own life on that belief, the entire power structure of organized crime in the Northeast shifted. The Italian mob never tried another hit on Bumpy Johnson again. They'd learned their lesson. Not because they feared his violence, they feared his wisdom. They feared his ability to see what was coming before it arrived. They feared a man who turned assassination attempts into weapons against his enemies. The lesson was hidden inside the story. It was always there, waiting to be discovered. The most dangerous weapon in the world isn't poison. It isn't a gun. It isn't money or power or fear. It's belief in human goodness. It's faith in a person's capacity to choose the right path when the moment comes. It's the willingness to bet everything, including your own life, on the idea that some people are worth saving. Because when you believe in someone that deeply, when you're willing to put your own existence on the line for that belief, it changes them. It transforms them at the cellular level. It makes them want to be worthy of that belief. Marcus Webb understood that now. He understood it the moment he made his choice not to poison Bumpy's food. Bumpy Johnson had understood it his whole life. He'd built an entire empire on the principle that respect comes from believing in people, not from ruling through fear. He'd shown Thomas Chen that he was worth saving. He'd shown Big Sam that there was a path to redemption through choice. And now he'd shown Marcus Webb that even a man hired to kill could find his way back to honor. And in the cold and dark of that meat freezer, in the moments when Marcus thought he was going to die, in the hours when he lay there shaking from cold and fear and despair, Marcus finally understood the full weight of what Bumpy had done for him. He wasn't being punished, he was being tested one final time. He was being shown that fear could be overcome, that cold could be endured, that despair was temporary, and that, on the other side of all that pain, was a man named Jerome coming to pull him out. A man sent by Bumpy. A man proof that Bumpy Johnson keeps his promises. He was going to live. Not because Bumpy was merciful, though he was the most merciful man Marcus would ever know. Not because Bumpy was strategic, though his strategy was so refined it seemed like chess played at a level Marcus could barely comprehend. But because Bumpy believed in him, because in a world that wanted him to be nothing but a killer, a tool, a disposable weapon, someone saw who he really was underneath all the desperation and fear. Someone saw the good man buried under the circumstances of his life, and that someone was willing to die to prove that goodness was real. That belief, that simple belief in human goodness, was the most powerful force in the universe. It was stronger than poison. It was stronger than guns. It was stronger than money. It was stronger than the mob, stronger than violence, stronger than all the forces that wanted to crush Marcus Webb into dust. Because belief in human goodness doesn't come from weakness. It comes from a strength so profound that you can afford to be merciful. You can afford to take risks. You can afford to believe in someone when they don't believe in themselves. And Marcus Webb would spend the rest of his life proving Bumpy Johnson right. He would prove it through every meal he cooked, every person he helped, every act of kindness he performed. He would prove it by becoming the man that Bumpy Johnson had seen in him when nobody else could see it. He would prove it by living a good life, by being an honest man, by being someone who could look himself in the mirror and know that he'd chosen the right path. Not because it was easy, but because someone had believed he could. In Denver, in that small restaurant above which he lived, Marcus Webb became a legend of sorts himself. Not the kind of legend that made newspapers or attracted attention from the underworld, but the kind of legend that mattered. The kind that came from treating people right, from paying fair wages, from giving people chances when they had nowhere else to go, from believing in the possibility of redemption for others, the way Bumpy Johnson had believed in redemption for him. People who worked for Marcus talked about how he could see something in people that they didn't see in themselves. How he could take someone broken and despairing and help them believe they could be better. How he could give a chance to a kid with a record, a woman trying to escape an abusive situation, a man struggling with addiction. And somehow, most of the time, those people found their way. Not because Marcus was magic, but because he'd learned something from Bumpy Johnson that he'd carry with him forever. Belief in human goodness is contagious. When someone believes in you that deeply, you have no choice but to believe in yourself. And so, the legacy continued. Marcus Webb took what Bumpy Johnson had given him and passed it on to others. He became what Bumpy had shown him it was possible to be. Not a king of an empire built on fear and power, but a man who wielded the only real power that mattered. The power to see potential in others, the power to offer second chances, the power to believe in redemption when redemption seemed impossible,